As we all know, divorce happens in two ways. One is abruptly, the other is methodically. Canada is probably going to experience both. Hello everyone, Marquette coming to you from Vancouver Island. Canada has historically been very good at working out internal problems, but we've hit an impasse, irreconcilable differences, as they say. So, divorce is coming. And we have two top contenders that could leave first, but each will leave in a very different way. Alberta will leave first, abruptly, and Quebec will leave second, methodically and easily. So why, you ask? Well, we know the abrupt type of divorce involves spouses whose frustration reaches a breaking point, and one day they just walk out the front door never to return, and they never look back. The other type involves a spouse who knows they're going to leave eventually. Maybe after the kids go off to university or when they retire, so they prepare. They get their own job and they set up their own business. They cultivate friendships separate from their spouse. Maybe they buy a second home. They have their own vehicle, insurance policy, investment accounts. Even the grief of losing the relationship is processed and let go of. So in every way possible, when they do actually leave, it'll be super easy. Now for the spouse left behind, there are always the telltale signs, if they're willing to pay attention and react accordingly. Canada was given the first real indication that Quebec was actually going to leave when she held the first referendum in 1980, openly asking its citizens if it should pursue secession. That referendum failed, and phew, Canada told itself, crisis averted. But then Quebec made a second attempt 15 years later, and that referendum happened on October 30th, 1995. The referendum question was not, should they pursue independence, but should they just go ahead and do it? And the question was blunt and simple. Do you agree that Quebec should become sovereign? By the narrowest of margins, 50.58% of Quebecers said, no, we want to stay in Canada. But just to be sure, Ottawa responded by essentially bribing Quebec to stay, and Quebec has not made an overt attempt ever since. But that doesn't mean that Quebec's ambitions were diminished. Not at all. Quebec has always held a unique station within Canada that goes all the way back to the Quebec Act of 1774, guaranteeing religious freedoms, the use of civil law instead of common law, and the continuation of French language culture. And since then, it has slowly gained ever-increasing autonomy. It got its own police force way back in 1870. It set up its own tax system and revenue system, Revenue Quebec, in 1954. It's the only province to do so. And in 1991, Canada gave Quebec exclusive control over immigrant selection. Now, it wasn't full control over immigration, but it was about as close as you could possibly imagine any subnational unit having. And I haven't even mentioned the language laws, but suffice it to say, the agreements, rights, and concessions that Quebec gained over time has effectively made her a nation within a nation. What is most interesting, however, is the economic independence that Quebec has pursued since the 1960s. And we can tell a lot about Quebec's ambition to leave just by looking at their economic game plan. So we have to remember that Montreal was Canada's most important city until the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s, when threats of Quebec independence and then separatist violence in the 1970s led many businesses to move to Toronto. A decade later, Toronto surpassed Montreal and became Canada's #1 city. This loss of power inside Canada was a real hardship for Quebec, but also a great impetus for it to take economic matters into its own hands, like it was doing with everything else. So it began to actively support major provincial companies, and then having these companies go off in search of international markets. Companies such as Bombardier, SNC-Lavalin, Hydro-Quebec, and Quebecor. Quebecor, for example, as a French-language media giant, uses its language and cultural resume to access French language markets around the world, and everywhere else in between that needs and wants phones, TVs, and the French language. SNC-Lavalin, now rebranded as Atkins Realis, is a massive international engineering firm with this complex web of consulting and engineering projects around the world, and is found throughout Canada, United States, Europe, and especially the Middle East. So the economic shift was always toward an economy that was not dependent on the rest of Canada. And that move toward international markets was massive and massively underreported. Between 1988 and 2005, Quebec's international exports went from only 21% of the province's economy to 37%. That shift away from domestic reliance had a geopolitical impact. It's not surprising, really, that between those two dates they held the 1995 referendum. While that proposal did fail by the faintest of margins, Quebec's international exports continue to grow, and they're now sitting at just over 50% of Quebec's GDP in 2025. This is huge. So we have to understand that essentially, when the Anglophone business elite, who effectively controlled the province, packed up and left in the 1960s and 70s, Quebec turned its culture inward, and economically, it turned its economy outward. So it has been so methodical in its plans to separate from Canada that today in 2026, Quebec is ready to go at any time. It's economically diversified. It has its own taxation system, its own police force, justice system, control of its language and culture, significant control over immigration, and it even has its own diplomatic corps that meets with diplomats and top-level business leaders from around the world. This doesn't even touch on the uncomfortable fact that Quebec has a strong grip on the rest of Canada's major institutions, including a firm hand on the shoulders of Canada's own armed forces. Every new full-time recruit who joins the Canadian Armed Forces has to go through training in Quebec, among other things. All that Quebec effectively lacks at this point is its own currency and a formal declaration of independence. The contrast with Alberta is something that makes one teary-eyed, and not in a good way. Alberta, by comparison, is completely unprepared in everything that matters. It doesn't have an economic policy that isn't deeply independent on just one customer. It doesn't have a diversified economy that can be economically stable and thus politically stable. It doesn't have a separate tax system that can manage its own affairs and plan for the future. It doesn't have its own police force, and it doesn't have its own media, which every successful coup d'etat leader knows is the most important thing of all. Not that Alberta is going through a coup d'etat, but still, every successful leader knows that capturing the local radio station, TV station, or internet server is the #1 strategy for success. Having control over the message is far more important than controlling the local legislative building or local leader. That's an amateur move, never the first. Quebec understands this. Quebec leadership controls the narrative through big media such as Quebecor. They control the message, the culture, the language, the story. Alberta has nothing like this. It has some good alternative media like the Western Standard and Juno News that are west-leaning, but it lacks a powerful nation-building narrative machine. These outlets, for example, don't own, buy, or sell the entire telecommunications infrastructure, such as phones, cable subscriptions, fiber optic cables in the ground, nor do they produce large-scale content or control any of the other hardware and software systems like Quebecor does. In other words, Alberta lacks a marketing plan. And of course, when it comes to the finer nuances of statehood, such as having an ambassador and a professional diplomatic corps, Alberta doesn't have that either. Alberta doesn't even have a border patrol, and hell, it doesn't even have real borders. A polygon wanting to be a country is not a good starting position, and hoping to add another polygon pretending to be a rectangle called Saskatchewan doesn't make it any better. In many ways, Alberta is like the rodeo king at the Stampede. He's acting like he's moving forward at breakneck speed to separate by Christmas, but all he's done is pack a change of clothes into a duffel bag and tossed it by the front door. Meanwhile, Quebec has ironed its travel clothes, made calls to international friends, organized the bank accounts and put the accountants on retainer, hired architects for the new house and made sure to organize cultural events promoting the shared vision. They've been moving their assets into their name and made sure the lawyers have crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's, as well as set up trust funds and done some long-term asset planning for the grandchildren. Quebec, to be blunt, has every right to be a little bit pompous in looking down on Alberta's independence movement as un bon citoyen, a nothing burger. Yet in spite of all this, and perhaps because of it, Alberta will be first. Why? Well, for starters, Albertans are different. When they're really pissed, they step out the front door and into a blinding blizzard without hesitation, and figure things out as they go. No plan needed, just a lot of grit and determination. And when the odds are stacked against them, which seems to be the way Albertans like it, there's nothing better than an insurmountable challenge that brings out the best in Albertans. A can-do attitude. And right now they've got the odds stacked against them like no other. Which, in a Sun Tzu Art of War kind of way, is exactly the reason they'll win. It sounds crazy to those who like control, but it sounds exhilarating to those that love freedom. So in spite of everything going against Alberta, I cannot see this going any other way. Alberta will be the first to leave. Because Albertans don't like talk. They like action, and they're frustrated, aka divorce option number 1. Now, could Canada get Alberta to stay, some might ask? And the simple answer is no. While Quebec was willing to sit down with the overlords in Ontario after the 1995 referendum and accept a bribe to stay a little longer, Albertans are not the kind of people that Ottawa could do that with, especially since the bribe money already comes from Albertans themselves. I believe there's a poker term for this. But anyway, let's just say that Ottawa doesn't have a hand to play in order to keep Alberta inside Confederation. Alberta holds the money card. The one thing Canada could use, if it so chooses, and I hope it doesn't, is what we might call nefarious means, namely propaganda and subversion. And this is already apparent to anyone watching the state broadcaster, the CBC. They're already trying to paint a narrative that says independence is too cumbersome a process, and so Alberta should just give up now. The talking heads at CBC appear to be overlooking reality. Independence movements only need about a third of the population to show they're on board with the idea. They don't actually need a majority. They don't even need democracy. The talking heads miss the obvious point that rules and independence movements don't automatically go hand in hand. A majority is only an expectation in a democracy under certain circumstances where the head government has legitimacy and a willingness to act in the best interests of all its citizens. Canada did at one time hold that kind of legitimacy in the eyes of its citizens, and everyone abided by the expectation of a civil democratic process involving a majority vote. But that situation no longer exists. Ottawa showed its citizens and the world just how manipulative it could be during the so-called pandemic. It brought to light the fact that it would never negotiate in good faith with citizens who held reasonable complaints about government overreach and abuse. And unlike some authoritarian governments, Ottawa doesn't have strong force capabilities to suppress its own citizens, so it had to use subversive manipulation and control instead through the RCMP, cartels, a corrupt justice system, and the propaganda machinery of state-controlled media. Now, Ottawa and their Laurentian elite destroyed the illusion of federal legitimacy and credibility through their actions against the trucker convoy in 2022. In other words, Ottawa's elites exposed themselves as fraudsters. Some of Canada's citizens haven't yet caught on to this, but enough people have. Enough to create an irreparably broken trust. And a lot of those people were from Alberta, a population that already has a culture with a natural tendency to automatically distrust government. So the Alberta independence movement will almost certainly go through the initial procedures of divorce with Ottawa. But at the end of the day, any attempt, or even a perceived attempt, by Ottawa to stall or block the movement is when all civilities will be dropped. I don't mean to imply that violence is inevitable, but only to suggest that we know from history how these things often go. Anyone that has gone through a divorce is well aware of this potential breakdown in procedure. And so in this case, I cannot see the Alberta independence movement following some long-winded prescribed process requiring endless hoops and procedures laid out by the Laurentian elite. Albertans don't kowtow, and therefore a majority vote, while expected as a courtesy to all Albertans, isn't necessarily going to be a prerequisite. The Alberta independence movement will go for its goals of independence if a reasonably significant portion of the population is behind them. As little as 30% will be enough, because it won't be following the rules laid out by Ottawa, especially in later stages after it really gets going. So as Albertans often like to say, the time for talk is over. And this will be a critical moment when the movement will simply turn away from and ignore Ottawa. And I say this realistically as someone who's been proudly Canadian my whole life. Ottawa would be best to let them go, although I suspect Ottawa will probably get desperate, have a panic attack, and see their power vanishing, and do something rash. That really stupid move by Ottawa will, of course, go down in the history books. Now, in spite of some potential ugliness, the final outcome will still be the same. Alberta leaves first, abruptly. But Quebec won't be far behind. She will be second. But in Quebec's case, it'll involve nothing more than a dusting of the mantle and Swiffering the floors before moving out, followed by a casual drive down to the Chateau Frontenac for a well-attended signing ceremony. Now, some argue Quebec will suffer. It won't. Quebec does receive as much as 50% of federal transfer payments, which come from British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. But that money only accounts for 8 to 10% of Quebec's entire provincial budget. If Quebec separated and lost 10% of its revenue, would it hurt? Yes, it would. But could it survive? Absolutely. If you think the loss of transfer payment income has not already been baked into the long-term exit plan, you'd be fooling yourself. It has. Quebec would have a short recession, tuition fees at universities would go up to what the rest of the world considers normal, a few social programs would be cut back, some infrastructure projects delayed by a few years, and then they would just carry on, exporting their diverse products and services and hardly noticing any change at all. Independence would not be a big deal for Quebec. For the rest of Canada, yes. For Alberta, there will definitely be pain involved. But for Quebec, it'll be a nothing burger. So in the end, Alberta leaves first, but Quebec is more prepared. And if you're wondering who goes third, well, the obvious bet would be on Saskatchewan. But my money is on Oregon. Okay, that's all for today. Bye for now.